In the scorching heat of the Mesopotamian desert, two great empires were about to clash in what would become one of the most devastating military disasters in Roman history. The year was 53 B.C.E., and Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's most powerful politicians, was about to learn that ambition without wisdom leads to catastrophe. Crassus was no ordinary Roman leader. As part of the First Triumvirate, alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, he wielded enormous political influence and possessed wealth that made him one of the richest men in Rome. But wealth and political power weren't enough for Crassus. He burned with jealousy as he watched Caesar conquer Gaul and Pompey achieve military glory in the East. Crassus desperately wanted his own military triumph, his own moment of glory that would cement his legacy as a great commander alongside his more famous partners. The Parthian Empire seemed like the perfect target. This vast eastern power controlled much of modern-day Iran and Iraq, ruling over the wealthy trade routes of Mesopotamia. To Crassus, the Parthians appeared weak and ripe for conquest.
He convinced himself that a quick campaign would bring him the military reputation he craved, along with unimaginable wealth from the conquest of their territories. What Crassus failed to understand was that the Parthians were far from weak. They were masters of desert warfare, with military tactics perfectly adapted to their harsh homeland. Against the advice of his most experienced officers and advisors, Crassus assembled a massive Roman army and marched eastward into Parthian territory. His advisors warned him about the difficult terrain, the extreme climate, and the reputation of Parthian warriors, but Crassus was blinded by his ambition. He was convinced that Roman discipline and heavy infantry tactics would easily overcome whatever resistance the Parthians could offer. As the Roman legions advanced deeper into Mesopotamian territory, they were entering a world completely alien to their experience. The Roman military machine was built around heavy infantry formations, disciplined soldiers in close formation who could overwhelm enemies through superior organization and equipment. These tactics had proven devastatingly effective against the Gauls, Germans, and other enemies Rome had faced in Europe. But the Mesopotamian desert would prove to be unlike any battlefield the Romans had ever encountered. The Parthians, meanwhile, were fully aware of the Roman advance. Under the command of their brilliant general Surena, they had been carefully preparing for this invasion. Rather than meet the Romans in direct battle, they planned to use the desert itself as their greatest weapon. The Parthian army was built around mobility and ranged warfare, with thousands of horse archers who could strike swiftly and then disappear before the Romans could retaliate. When the first Parthian attacks came, the Romans were completely unprepared for what they faced. Wave after wave of horse archers swept toward the Roman formations, unleashing clouds of arrows before wheeling away, just as Roman soldiers moved to pursue them. The Roman legionaries, weighed down by heavy armor and equipment, found themselves unable to close with an enemy that refused to stand and fight. The Parthian tactics were devastatingly effective. Their mounted archers would charge toward the Roman lines, release volleys of arrows with deadly accuracy, then retreat before the Romans could respond. Any Roman attempt to pursue was futile, as the heavily armored legionaries could never catch the swift Parthian horses in the desert terrain. Even worse for the Romans, when their arrow supplies seemed exhausted, the Parthians simply retreated to supply trains of camels, loaded with fresh ammunition, returning to continue their deadly harassment. As the battle continued, the Roman situation became increasingly desperate. The desert heat was merciless, water was scarce, and Roman soldiers began collapsing from exhaustion and heat stroke, even before Parthian arrows found their marks. The traditional Roman military formation, the testudo or tortoise shell of interlocked shields, provided some protection from the arrow storms, but it also trapped the Romans in a slow-moving defensive formation that prevented any effective counterattack. Recognizing that his situation was becoming critical, Crassus attempted to negotiate with the Parthians. He sent messages to Surena requesting a meeting to discuss terms for ending the conflict. This was a desperate move by a commander who was beginning to understand that his confident predictions of easy victory had been tragically wrong. But Surena, sensing Roman weakness, had no interest in allowing his enemies an honorable escape from their predicament. The Parthian general agreed to negotiations, but only as part of a larger deception. When Crassus sent an envoy to the Parthian camp to begin discussions, Surena immediately captured the Roman representative. This treacherous act eliminated any possibility of diplomatic resolution and demonstrated that the Parthians intended to destroy the Roman army completely. Desperate to break the stalemate and rescue his captured envoy, Crassus made a fateful decision. He ordered his son Publius to lead a cavalry charge against the Parthian forces. Publius commanded 8 cohorts of Roman infantry, 500 archers, and 1,300 cavalry, many of them Gallic warriors who had served with distinction in Caesar's campaigns. This force represented a significant portion of Crassus's army, and its success or failure would likely determine the outcome of the entire campaign. Initially, the attack seemed to achieve some success. When Publius's force advanced, the Parthian horse archers began their usual tactic of retreating while shooting arrows. But this time, the retreat seemed more genuine, encouraging Publius and his men to pursue more aggressively than they had before. The Romans chased the apparently fleeing Parthians across the desert, believing they had finally found a way to force their enemies into decisive combat. But this was exactly what Surena had planned. The retreating horse archers were leading Publius's force into a carefully prepared trap. After drawing the Romans far from the main army, the Parthian archers suddenly turned to face their pursuers. At the same moment, Surena's entire army appeared, including heavily armored Cataphracts cavalry that had been hidden from Roman view. The Romans found themselves completely surrounded on a small hill, cut off from any hope of rescue. The battle that followed was a massacre. Publius's Gallic cavalry, brave as they were, had no experience fighting in desert conditions against heavily armored opponents. Their charge against the Parthian Cataphracts failed completely, and they were forced to retreat to the hilltop where Publius had positioned his infantry. The Romans formed a defensive circle, but their elevated position made them even more vulnerable to Parthian arrows, which could now strike the rear ranks that had previously been protected by the front lines. Recognizing that his situation was hopeless, Publius attempted to surrender. He and his officers threw down their weapons, hoping the Parthians would accept their capitulation. But Surena was interested in total victory, not prisoners. Of Publius's entire force, only 500 men were taken alive. The rest, including Publius himself, were slaughtered where they stood. Back at the main Roman camp, Crassus was initially unaware of the complete disaster that had befallen his son's force. He knew the attack had failed, but he didn't understand the full extent of the catastrophe until Parthian riders appeared carrying Publius's severed head on a spear. The psychological impact on the remaining Roman soldiers was devastating. They had watched their comrades march out with confidence, only to see their commander's head displayed as a trophy by their enemies. The sight of his son's death broke something fundamental in Crassus. The ambitious politician, who had dreamed of military glory, was confronted with the horrible reality of his decisions. In a final desperate attempt at revenge, he tried to rally his remaining troops for one last assault against the Parthians. But his men, already demoralized by months of harassment and now horrified by the fate of their comrades, had little fight left in them. The final Parthian assault was swift and decisive. Surena's forces attacked the Roman camp from multiple directions, with horse archers creating chaos while heavily armored Cataphracts smashed through whatever defensive lines the Romans managed to establish. Many Roman soldiers attempted to flee, but the Parthian cavalry pursued them relentlessly across the desert, cutting down anyone who tried to escape. Crassus himself died in the final battle, along with most of his senior officers. The Roman army that had marched so confidently into Mesopotamia was virtually annihilated. 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed or captured, representing one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. The surviving prisoners were paraded through Parthian cities as symbols of their complete victory over the supposedly invincible Roman legions. Legend holds that the Parthians poured molten gold down Crassus's throat after his death, a symbolic punishment for the greed that had driven him to attempt this disastrous campaign. Whether true or not, this story perfectly captured how the Parthians viewed their enemy's motivations and the justice of his fate. The Battle of Carrhae sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world and beyond. For generations, Romans had believed their military system was superior to anything their enemies could field. The complete destruction of Crassus's army by foreign tactics and unfamiliar warfare shattered this confidence and forced Rome to recognize that they were not invincible. The political consequences were equally severe. The death of Crassus destroyed the First Triumvirate, removing the stabilizing influence he had provided between Caesar and Pompey. This political vacuum contributed directly to the civil wars that would eventually destroy the Roman Republic and lead to the rise of the empire under Augustus. The Parthians, meanwhile, had established themselves as Rome's most dangerous enemy in the east. The victory at Carrhae proved that Roman expansion was not inevitable, and that skillful opponents using appropriate tactics could defeat even the most disciplined Roman armies. This lesson would influence military thinking for generations and establish the Parthian Empire as Rome's primary rival for centuries to come.